How's everyone doing this week?
Pretty good. Do we have anything on the agenda? I was looking earlier.
No, I didn't have any kind of anything on there myself other than just announcing that Container Plumbing Days is next Monday. I figured I would
Yeah.
re-announce that, but
Are you going?
it's an open agenda. I am not going to that one.
Me neither.
So open agenda for whatever folks want to talk about today.
Is there any movement on the maintainers discussions? The top secret maintainers discussions?
The only thing I've been seeing is people dropping off. I haven't seen anybody getting added into it. I think that needs to get rebooted a little bit here. And yeah, I mean, even dropping one of them off there, we don't have the votes to do that right now. So it needs work.
Cool.
Yeah, myself, I'm just kind of getting back into the office a little bit right now. I was out chasing the sun earlier this week.
Where'd you go?
Went over to Cleveland and actually had a pretty decent view from over there.
Nice. I forgot about the eclipse for a little bit. I was just thinking you were trying to go somewhere sunny and went to Cleveland.
Oh, no, no, no. It was staring at the sun, saying, hey, getting dimmer, getting dimmer. And then all of a sudden, it completely turned off.
Very cool.
Black spot in the middle where it used to be bright. So, yeah, no agenda. What do folks want to talk about today?
Is there any updates from either working group?
The image compatibility working group has been going through various proposals and they're going a couple different directions and probably wouldn't mind getting some guidance from people outside to say what they should be doing instead. I know they chatted at KubeCon with some folks, had a couple meetings on site there, and well, one during presentation and one during our OCI meeting there. And I feel like some of the community was pushing towards something simpler. I've got a proposal in there just that says use annotations and have runtimes look at the annotation if they want to, and if they don't, they can ignore it. That's gotten some thumbs up from folks who looked at that one. A bunch of the other contributors, though, are looking for something that is a lot more involved because they're looking at use cases from a completely different perspective. I've been looking at this from the runtime perspective. How do we pick which image to deploy? They are looking at this from a provisioning a cluster standpoint of how do we spin up nodes that are most appropriate to run this workload. And so when you talk about provisioning hardware, that's a very different problem than what runtimes are looking at.
Makes sense.
For auth, no progress. I think it's just a lack of time from everybody these days.
Yeah. Is auth, I mean, yeah, the auth thing still kind of confuses me about where OCI stops and, vendor specific auth starts or implementation specific auth starts.
I think we're trying to draw that line in terms of here is how you could get a little bit more complex, and to put those lines in there. But for the most part, we're looking at just from the distribution spec, the API calls what the client needs to tell the server needs to tell the client, and if they're talking to a token server and whatnot.
Mhm.
And we're going to try to delegate as much as possible to upstream OIDC and OAuth and other specs out there that we can delegate to so we aren't re-implementing anything.
Cool.
The place that that doesn't work as well is that I think a lot of the assumptions, well, there are two assumptions, and I think it's OIDC or maybe it's OAuth too. Can never keep track of them. It gets complicated in that there's no way for in the spec, not in our spec, but in the upstream specs, for the server to say, here's where you need to go talk to get your token from. And so containers and everything have just mitigated that by shoving that into it's the service field, I think, something like that. One of the fields that go in there where you specify where you're getting your token from, we put that in a field ourselves. And so that kind of decouples. The client doesn't have to know anything special about it, where normally you're talking to a web page and the web page knows what servers you're allowed to talk to. Because the person wrote the web page. In our case, we have 1 million clients, 1 million servers. The client's not going to know every possible server it can talk to.
Yeah.
The other part that we're looking at is how much can we make scope more flexible in terms of when you make a request, because right now, I should rephrase that a little bit. Right now, when you make a connection, you'll say, I want to pull this image from this repository, or
Right.
even more difficult, I want to push an image to this repository. Well, before you push, a lot of times the first thing you do is you check, is it already there? And
Yeah.
so you do an initial pull just to check, see if the digest shows up. If it's already there, you're done. If you do that, what authentication request do you get back from the server? And typically what you get back is the server says, hey, you need to request a token that gives you access to pull this image, because that's what you did. You try to do a head request against it. If you try to reuse that same token to the server, it needs to know to tell you that you didn't have enough scope. Please go get some more scope versus you're not authorized to use content.
And most servers implement push as like excluding the pull APIs? Like I would expect some to say, if you have push, like we'll let you pull too. Is that not what?
But think of the vice versa. If you have pull, because you did
If you
a
have pull,
query
then
to
you can't
see.
push, totally.
Yeah.
But if you have push, you shouldn't have to, like if you, are you
Yeah,
saying
but
that the first
the problem for
request
people that are doing a push is the first step in a push is that you check the resource, is it already there? And so you do an initial pull.
Yeah.
And that's just on one repository. What if you've got an action where a client's talking to multiple repositories now?
Mhm.
And so the token you get back is very scoped to the initial request you do. And so there needs to be a way for registries to know, I need to ask for more access, or I need to tell the client they don't have access. And how do they tell the difference between the two of those? A bunch that has been left up as an exercise of the registry, and that usually doesn't work out so well for clients.
Yeah.
Because registries often just default to, no, you didn't have the access you're supposed to have, because the way the Docker engine has been written in the past is that it made every request on a per request basis. So it reinitialized authentication every time it was doing another image pull or another image push. And they also incorporate a bunch of client-side knowledge on what they're getting ready to do. And so they would intentionally request a token with more access than what they might necessarily need. They were building the scope on the fly on the client side, then depending on what the server scope was.
Cool.
So because of that, this gets a little bit more complicated. And I think we've kind of sat back and not really gotten a solid answer to where we're going to go with that. I've been puttering on the side, making my own client. And so I fear when I start adding authentication to that, I'll probably just in parallel write a proposal and see where that goes. But Otherwise, if anyone's got free time, that one is wide open, looking for folks that just have the time to write some proposals of what this should look like.
Hey, Sam.
Sam and Brian both getting a good crowd today.
Saw the agenda was late.
It's social hour now. I mean, if they're all going to show up now, I'm just going to start throwing stuff on the agenda.
Oh, sorry. I had a conflict come up. I got to drop.
Same. I gotta drop. I actually do have to drop at 10:30. So live agenda is good for me. I said hi, Sam.
Hi, Michael.
For those that joined late, this is a no agenda meeting, which basically means no one put anything on the agenda. So the floor is open for anybody that has stuff they want to chat about. Otherwise, we can wrap up early. Looking back at last week's meeting, I still have my little side agenda of working on a tag listing API. So wish list items are there. I'll be puttering on that one at some point here. Are there any objections if I was to make a V2 of the tag listing API to just start writing as a pull request, or do folks want to see that turn into a full-fledged working group and proposals and other stuff?
Start with PR.
Sounds good.
That's how we ended up with the first working group.
I'll try it without a PR, and we'll see if folks say, yeah, we need one later.
Well, so you start with the PR, right?
Start with a PR, and then if someone says, no, this needs more debate, discussion, everything goes back to TOB, create a working group. Group gets created, create implementations, implementation gets created, votes, debates, discussions, and then turns back into a PR.
Yeah.
Sasha, I see you popping in and out of mute there.
I was just going to suggest in the PR, if you can call out that this might potentially lead to a working group if needed, then people won't be surprised.
Yeah. Is there, are we like aligned on, I know some people wanted specific functionality.
We've got a bit of a wish list in last week's notes.
Wasn't sure if all of that was compatible.
See how far I get before I run into challenges. I think one of the bigger challenges is if we start doing search capability. A lot of it should be relatively straightforward.
Yeah.
And I suspect a bunch of this is going to end up being optional stuff where if the registry wants to let you know about historical tags, it could, but doesn't have to.
Mhm.
Some of them would be pretty easy to add in there. Untagged manifest descriptors instead of just the tag name. I think a lot of that would be pretty easy to add. Search is going to be a little more complicated though. Sajay, what are you thinking of on the tag history? It needs time and discussion.
I think a lot of questions that you've had get answered through tag history to some extent. Like, what's this tag? How does this tag change, kind of thing. I mean, we've discussed about Dockerhub's implementation of keeping tags around if it was ever tagged and things like that. So there's no standard API, and I think we're all kind of like building our own set of APIs. Distribution has a hidden implementation of keeping the tag history also. So, but unfortunately it's going to take a while before we even prototype this, show this, and actually get it to work. So I wouldn't come to putting up a proposal unless we have a candidate set of this is how the tag history API is working.
Even if I make it a PR, I would make it a draft. Because you're right, we want implementations.
And would historical tag, that'd be a separate API, right? Or would that just be, are we thinking of that in the same API?
Could be a different API. I think those are the discussions that I would like to have. Like, how would you like to see the API? Because different providers keep the tag history, and you can see it in some cases, cannot see it in some cases. So clients can't use the API because there's no standard way of doing it. But if you were to say that this is the common denominator set, then this can be where the API can live.
Are we thinking potentially of 3 APIs? One for the tag listing that might include not just tags, but untag manifest and just get back descriptors. One for the history of a single tag, and one for some kind of search interface.
I was thinking the one question people want to have is, or rather have had is, can I delete this digest? And that's more like a digest to tag question. And the second one would be, how has this tag changed over time, right? Like you've given a 1.1. What were the previous digests that this tag pointed to so that you can find out that, and then you can see whether the tag needs to be updated, or tools like Dependabot and whatnot use that. So from a scenario perspective, there are many clients that keep history by polling and keeping track, and it's actually quite painful because they have to know when the digest changed or when the tag changes. So those were the two things I was thinking about. I did not think about the like list all manifests and those kind of things, which is also maybe that's where you're going with. Like, I just want to see all the manifests, or I want to see. We don't even have an API to show all the tags of a given digest right now.
I think that gets into a bit of John's request, which was somewhat of a reverse lookup. Tell me everything that points to a given digest. If you give it a layer digest, it will tell you all the image manifests that point to that layer. If you give it a digest of an image, it would tell you all the index entries that has in there, or the tags that point to it.
Oh yeah, definitely. That's a big ask. I mean, always, you don't know whether you can delete something, and we have to go back and look up every tag that this digest points to.
Although calling those all tag APIs is going to get interesting because tags are in there, but tags isn't necessarily what we're doing. This might be a scenario to make a, no, we don't call it a plugin, an extension of the distribution spec, and start throwing some more stuff in there and see what happens. At which point we turn into a working group. Maybe I'll start with a minimal viable product. Take the easy items first.
Yeah, that's why I didn't start with the APIs themselves. if you could call out the scenarios like, hey, discovering all tags of a given digest is important, right? Or the other way around, like giving me the changes of the digest of a given tag. Those would, then we can discuss what the API should look like, whether it should be on the extension or what. Because the moment we jump into APIs, I think a lot of conflicts come in, and it would be hard to kind of like justify why we're doing it in a particular way. But if the scenario is right, we can at least hold it to, it is what we want to solve.
Well, part of the hope is if I start small and just find the easy stuff and throw that into one API that gets a bunch of value, and maybe we'll extend it later on. Maybe that can get merged earlier rather than going through the full process and getting everything solved in one PR. All right, anything else people want to talk about this week? I know a couple of you have early cutoffs here. Going once, going twice. It's going to feel like a short week for me. Showing up late, meetings early. It's going to be like a 2-day work week. All right. On that note, have a good rest of your week, folks, and follow up on GitHub or Slack. Till next week. Cheers.
Yep, yep, well.